off. There we are. Well, thank you so much for joining us, everyone. This is a Praxis event under Westar, and we are joined today by Dr. Terrance Dean. The topic of today is Black First Ladies of the Black Church. And I know virtually nothing about this, and I'm really excited. Yeah, I'm really excited to hear a lot about it. I'm going to do my best to facilitate, but I really am. I'm really leaning on you. And so I'm really excited to hear about the topic. And I want to say to everyone joining us today, thank you for joining this Praxis event. Praxis is an initiative under Westar that tries to bridge the gap between sort of academic scholarship and in practice stuff and theology. And so we love having interesting people join us. And so we're really excited to talk to Terrance Dean today with this topic. And if you have any questions or any comments or stuff, put it in the Q&A and I'll do my best to facilitate that and throw that out as we go through this presentation. So yeah, thank you so much. Dr. Terrance Dean, over to you. I don't know if you'd like to do a little introduction about yourself as well for those who may not know about you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all for being here. As you mentioned, Colin mentioned, I am actually a Westar Fellow. Been a part of the think tank for over a year now. So I'm going into my second year. But I am an assistant professor of Black Studies at Denison University in Granville, Ohio, 30 minutes right outside of Ohio, Columbus. For those of you who are familiar with Ohio, and Ohio State, probably most people are familiar with. It's a small liberal arts school. I specialize in religion and Black church studies. I got my PhD from Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. So I'm very excited about today's conversation. My interests lie around gender, sex, and sexuality, and how it situates itself within the discourse of Black church studies. So looking for autonomy for persons' bodies, identities, and how they're shaped and formed under theological contexts. So hopefully today we'll be able to get some of that and you all will be able to hear more about the work that I'm doing. A current book, which is actually the title of this seminar, Black First Ladies of the Black Church.
You can plug it as much as you want. This is your space. You can do that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome. So do we roll right into it or is it open for?
Absolutely, yeah. So you can use me as a bouncing board as much as you like. You can talk as much as you like. I'm happy to throw some questions. I mean, just to start, do you want to talk about the topic itself and just what it is that your project sort of surrounds?
Yeah. So I think people are very familiar with their own pastor or preacher if you're affiliated with a church and the Christian tradition, a faith tradition. So in the Black faith tradition for the Black church, generally the pastors and preachers who are married, their wives are entitled with the term first ladies. So they're first ladies of the church. And it becomes almost synonymous with meaning like they're first ladies of the Black community. Because because if you are very familiar with the Black church, it is an institution that is heavily ingrained within the Black community because it serves much more than just a spiritual institution. And so one of the things that we look at the Black church, if you look at it through the civil rights era, for most persons who are not familiar with the Black church, but Martin Luther King Jr., Medgar Evers, those names that you probably heard who were right, James Baldwin, who are persons who are very significant to the civil rights movement and era. The Black church served more than a spiritual foundation and institution where people went on a Sunday to get the word and hear the word of God. It was also a bank, a health institution, schools, and place where people just communed and got information that was happening within community. So during slavery and up until the civil rights era, as we all know, slavery, for many Black people, they didn't have a form of communication other than what's happening in the community, but through the form of the church. So the church was really in its initial beginnings of for the Black community was a very social place. The way I think most people see it, it's always been like, Sunday, you play your Sunday finest, you go to church on Sunday, and you don't go back to church until the next Sunday. Well, for in the Black community, you go to church every day because it was where they disseminated information. It was where they were able to translate information and tell what was happening in the community. deaths that happened, births, marriages, any information that needed to be, shared within the African American community. That's where they went to get the information. So that's where a lot of social organizations began within the Black church. So like the Links, the Black Men's Masons, and things of that nature were formed in the Black community. So they created social groups. So these clubs and organizations would meet in the Black church because for slavery and up into the civil rights era, it was a very neutral ground, a very neutral place where they knew that they were not under scrutiny under any other institution that could marginalize them or keep them oppressed. So this is one of the reasons why we talk about the Black church as not being just a spiritual institution, because Black people also went there when they started banks. The African American banks, or they want to know how I can get a loan or things of that nature. So again, all of the church serves so many other purposes other than the spiritual foundation. If people were in debt or they needed a loan, they went to the church. If people needed marriage counseling, they went to the church. If Black persons needed health support, they went to the Black church. And so and another thing is if Black persons needed help with drugs or anything like that, any I would say common concern that we would have in our normal practices, we would say, oh, why don't you go see a doctor? Or why don't you go to a bank? Or why don't you go to a school? Schools were very instrumental. And I'll talk more about that, how schools became instrumental and part of the Black church as a way to help educate so many other Black persons. So with that in mind, Black women were the key source of disseminating the information because they knew everything that was happening in the Black community. So the Black First Lady, in some regard, became the key holder of not only maintaining the church family, but also maintaining the family of the Black community as a whole within itself. So she would become the go-to. So she would become not only a surrogate mother to people who were needing advice or someone to go to help with support for their families. She became a surrogate sister. She became a surrogate aunt. She became a surrogate grandmother. But more so, she became the buffer between her husband, who was the preacher and the pastor, and the Black community. So if the pastor needed to know what was happening going on in the community, he would go to his wife.
So you had this spiritual side, and then this sort of, it almost sounds like a matriarch. I mean, I don't want to use that term, but it almost seems like this this special role that you're talking about. Yeah.
Exactly. You're absolutely right. So, but a lot of times, first ladies understand that they're a special calling. So when we're talking about like calling that most preachers and pastors have, a calling on their life to serve the church, most first ladies feel that they also have that same role of being called because of the role that they play with their husband, and also being spiritually in tune to community as well. So you're absolutely right when you say a matriarch of the family, but also a matriarch of the community. So that's why we bequeath them with the title of first ladies.
Yeah, that's really cool.
So it's nothing uncommon for us to hear that term. And they're like royalty in the Black community in some regard, because of the role that they serve and things that they've done for the community. So one of the things I was inspired by, and there's a phrase, if it wasn't for the women, we know that the church would not be able to sustain itself or move forward because of the contributions that women have done and have helped the church and maintain the church in some regard. So with that in mind, Black women in the Black community become like these huge waymakers, seers, and prophetess, and other terms that we can think of that relate to them as being spiritual guides, but also nurturers in that regard. So Black First Ladies, why I'm inspired to write the book, I thought about Martin Luther King Jr. and his wife, Coretta Scott King. I thought about Medgar Evers and his wife, Myrlie Evers. And because they were critical figures throughout the civil rights movement, and they traveled a lot. And see, I don't think people really understand that when preachers and pastors who are constantly on the road, the church is literally left into the hands of the board that's there, and they may give some directives, but the wives are left behind, and they have to keep the church going. Like, they have to keep the spirits of the community up. They have to keep the spirit of their husband up, and they have to keep the spirit of the congregation up as well. So the burden falls on women in such a way that I don't think we get a chance to really hear the stories of what it means for Coretta to be in bed or at night having conversation with Martin about what's happening in the Black community, things that he would not tell us or tell the community as a whole, but he would share in private with his wife.
What are the records like for that? Like, I don't know if we're jumping ahead too far, but how do you go about doing the research for that? Because that's, yeah.
So there are some biographies on Coretta Scott King and Merle Evers, but what I've been actually doing firsthand oral history, and I've been interviewing first ladies of Black churches, prominent Black churches in the African-American community, as well as mid-sized and even small churches throughout the United States. Because I really want them to tell the story. What does it mean to serve in that role, to maintain that spiritual cloth that they made, I would proffer, that keeps them on a day-to-day basis of serving community, serving the church, because that's a lot to carry. And to be seen as a mediator between community and the faith tradition. So I look at them as the sacred and profane, if we want to use that term as well. But what does that mean for them? So I've been interviewing a lot of first ladies across the country. It's been a fascinating project, a fascinating experience to hear their stories. And I'll share a little bit of what I've been writing so you all can get a chance to hear that.
Cool.
Thank you, Colin. But I think we don't hear too much of the stories of the women. We tend to hear stories of women who are in pastoral positions and are preachers. So a lot of texts have not really uncovered women's work within the Black church or in the church period. And I don't want to demean or make light of the work. When we think of work, what does that mean? Because I'm not talking about work in a traditional sense. We can think of work of like those who read the announcements during the Sunday service, those women who put together the program, those women who actually put together the entire service, the worship service, the women who are in the background, making things happen, the women who are downstairs, and for those of you who ever attended a Black church, in the basement, they're cooking the dinner for after Sunday meals. So when people come downstairs, they're the ones who are doing the labor of making sure community is being fed. So there's so many tangibles and interchangeable things that are happening within the Black church that people, I think, don't understand. Like, women have continued to maintain and surface and push this this narrative of how Black women continue to serve in so many ways. And it's through each of those services that they hear the stories, right? Because when you're working side by side with someone, you can talk about what's happening in the community. So-and-so, down the street, she's about to get married, but she's seeing that other little boy down there. So these stories, they start talking and they start sharing information. Have you checked on Sister Mary last week? She got the sugar. So when we talk about those things, we know that means diabetes. but
Okay.
But we know that's coded language, meaning what is the church doing to make sure she's okay? How do we make sure that she's in? So the First Lady is always in the part of those conversations being woven in. And again, because these are sometimes conversations the pastor probably would never be privy to or to hear, because these women are working together in a collective with one another. So that's where I talk about like Black feminist and womanist thought coming into play. And those are the theological and theoretical terms that I'm using. And I'll share with you all what womanist mean, because I'm pretty sure you've heard the term, but may not sure what a womanist is or what that womanist term means. And it was coined by Alice Walker. If you're familiar with Alice Walker, the author who's wrote The Color Purple, but has written so many other texts and novels as well. But she coined the term in 1983, and this is what she called. This is how she phrases what womanist is, and it's a huge contribution in theological terms, especially to Black female scholars and Black religion scholars. She says womanist comes from womanish, girlish, frivolous, irresponsible, not serious. A Black feminist or feminist of color. From the Black folk expression of mothers to female children, you acting womanish, i.e. like a woman, usually referring to outrageous, audacious, courageous, or willful behavior. Wanting to know more and in greater depth than is considered good for one. Interested in grown-up doings, acting grown up, being grown up. Interchangeable with another Black folk expression, you trying to be grown, responsible, in charge. So those are terms in Black cultural vernacular. You say, oh, you acting real fast, or so that means you're too grown for your britches, is what we'll say. Also, what womanist means is a woman who loves other women sexually or non-sexually, appreciates and prefers women's culture, women's emotional flexibility, values tears as natural counterbalance of laughter, and women's strength. Sometimes loves individual men sexually and or non-sexually, committed to survival and wholeness of entire people, male and female, not a separatist, except periodically for health. Traditionally universalist, as in, mama, why are we brown, pink, and yellow and our cousins are white, beige, and Black? The answer, well, the colored race is just like a flower garden with every color flower represented. Traditionally capable, as in, mama, I'm walking to Canada and I'm taking you and a bunch of other slaves with me. The reply, it wouldn't be the first time. Women love music, loves dance, loves the moon, loves the spirit, loves love and food and roundness, loves struggle, loves the folk, loves herself regardless. Womanist is to feminist as purple to lavender.
Wow. That last line is beautiful, but
Right.
there's a lot there. There's a lot there because that's all under that's one term.
Yes. So you see why Black women gravitated to that term, because it spoke to them in such a way that helped to bring story, narrative, and nuance to their being. Someone recognizes them, someone sees them in their wholeness and their fullness.
Yeah, and in a way, I think, like, you compare that to the term feminist, right? And it does a very different thing, right?
Right, yeah. Oh, Cindy, I see your question, and I'll go ahead and answer it because this is really great. Since more and more women are being ordained, how is the role of First Lady being filled by the church? Is a woman pastor expected to fill the roles of both of a pastor and First Lady? So to answer your question, the fact that she's married to a pastor or preacher, she's automatically a First Lady. So no matter what, she cannot run away from that title. It's already being bequeathed to her. Second thing, many First Ladies are preachers and pastors of their own right. So they do marry their husbands, but a lot of them also have been called to preach and pastor. So there are a lot of women who are First Ladies who also serve as pastors and preachers as well for their church. And they also travel as well on the road. So they do have a larger role. So, not only are they First Lady, where they're helping to usher and bring along people and keep them and nurture them within community. They serve as pastor and preacher as well, preaching to the souls, pastoring to a congregation, and helping to spread the word as well. So there's a duality in that role. And a lot of them have their own families. So we have to think about that as well. Not only do they have to be a wife, but they also have to be a mother. And they also have to protect and make sure and maintain their own family as well. So their roles are complicated, they're nuanced. This is one of the reasons, like I said, I love using the terminology womanist and Black feminist with them as well, and those the same vein. Because there's, there's another saying called this bridge called my back, and how women's back have always become the bridge from one place to another, through slavery, through the civil rights movement, to the Black Lives Matter movement of today, how Black women continue to show up for community in ways that are unexpected and called upon for them to serve and help us to get from one location to another. So this book, I cannot express how excited I am to talk about the non-traditional roles, but how we see women and also making them more visible in spaces that we don't traditionally see them.
Do you find, I'm not sure, this is kind of part of Cindy's question here. I'm not sure what kind of role does, if they're married to a husband, does the husband, like, do they take on that communicative information role, or I don't know, like what happens? I'm wondering that if that husband finds himself in a similar role that the Black First Lady often finds themselves previously in the other relationship, when it's the other way around, or not. I don't know.
Oh, so if he is married to a woman who's a preacher,
yeah,
he becomes the first husband.
and then does he serve that similar, where there's the one spiritual side, and then he serves the kind of information other side of community? I don't know.
He could. But there's something unique about women in conversation, women in group, women in gathering. We talk about the gathering of women together.
Right.
Something happens that transforms community in such a way that I think it's very uniquely different the way men gather. I don't think we gather in the sense to bring and find out what's happening in the community. Like, yeah, me and Colin, you and I, have you been over to Sister Jones' house?
right.
Because things happen when they're doing hair, with one another, when they're dressing one another, when they're out shopping with one another, when they're out doing things that are capturing intimate moments, which I think privies first ladies in such a way that women come to them and feel more comfortable. I'm not sure, how many people feel comfortable talking about what's happening in their sex life. But there's a nurturing component, and that's what I said. If I could read something, I think that would be very helpful to nuance,
Sure.
first ladies and how I describe what they mean to the Black community.
Sure.
The womanist definition, I can copy it and share it for you all, for those who might want a copy of it. But I got it from Toward a Womanist Homiletic, and it says Katie Cannon, Alice Walker, and Emancipatory Proclamation, and it's written by Donna Allen. So, and it's on the very first page. So I can make a copy of it and share it with you all. So make sure share with Colin.
Yeah, that'd be amazing. Forward me all the information, and then I'll make sure we send it out. That'd be amazing.
Cool. Oh wow, yes. So I don't know, because they were learning from a churchman that their pastor husband, the first ladies, were having multiple sexual relations with preparation. Yeah, Sarah, I'll talk about that. That's a really great question. And Natalie, patriarchy and misogynoir, yes, have shown up in the space of Black women who have had in church. If a woman marries a male pastor, you're automatically a first lady and expected to pick up a certain role. Yeah. So there is expectations for a lot of women who marry into, and a lot of them are resistant because and I don't want you to think that the role of first lady is very traditional, because it's not. Each woman is very uniquely different in how she serves as first lady. Some may see their roles, because a lot of them do have calling that I mentioned. They take up a mission. They may take up a cause. Some first ladies say, I want to feed the homeless, and that's going to be my mission. Or I want to make sure young women are brought more to the church and to Christ. They make that their mission. Another may work on sex and sexuality and make that her mission. Another may work on financial literacy. So each first lady, they do pick up a cause that they find very near and dear to them and make that their mission. And they create a lot of organizations and groups and bring those to the church. But misogynoir and patriarchy plays a huge part, because Traditionally, particularly in the Black church, particularly in the Pentecostal faith tradition and some faith traditions, women cannot serve in leadership roles. Women cannot serve in pastoral roles. And so there's a balance that we talk about within that in the text that I'm writing, what that looks like for someone who have accepted that as, this is what it is, but I look at it through the lens of womanist and Black feminists, how even though they're not seen in traditional leadership roles, the roles that they do play within the church are very leadership oriented. And the way they show up as a dynamic part of that, and how utilizing Black feminist theory and womanist theoretical works situates them within the same power play as their male counterparts. So I talk about that. There is a very huge difference in dynamic that needs to be addressed within the Black church, because patriarchy plays a huge part and how women are seen and served within the Black church. So thank you for raising that question. It's a gendered problem. It's a sexual problem. Sexuality plays a huge part. I think it was Sarah who raised the question. She's known two first ladies who came to her for counseling because they were learning from church members that the pastor, husbands of the first ladies, were having multiple sexual relationships with parishioners. Have you heard from the first ladies about this situation? Yes. A lot of the first ladies share that their husbands, they've learned their husbands either thought about it, they faced and encountered women who go after their husbands, the confrontations that happen. I'll share one story of a prominent church in Detroit, Greater Grace. I don't know if you all heard of Greater Grace Temple Church in Detroit, Michigan. It's one of the biggest churches, a mega church. They do a lot in community. Again, they help with financial literacy. They buy up buildings. They have a school. They help the homeless. They do so much in community for the Black community. When I was talking to the first lady, and she met her husband, she had went to go visit the church, and her husband inquired about, well, he wasn't her husband at the time, but the pastor had inquired about her, and she was a student at Michigan State University at the time. But she said she had no desire in dating a pastor because she knew what came with that. She knew, the responsibility and all of that came with that, but she was also afraid of the other women because she had heard that he had already been, seeing a lot of women, had been dating openly a lot of women, and she didn't want to be involved in that. But they continued dating, and she ended up marrying him. And she said it was very difficult the first couple of years of her helping and serving the church, because he had dated so many women in the church, or women who were coming for him.
Oh yeah.
That it was very difficult for her to win and gain the congregation's trust for her. And she said it was very difficult for her the first couple of years. So you're absolutely right that it's a common and it's an unfortunate common practice that women throw themselves at pastors in some regard in the Black church, because the Black preacher is seen as someone almost like a godlike figure. They, the money, they see the cars and all those things. And being first lady is sort of like a celebratory status, to have. Yeah, you're right. Men have responsibility as well. And we don't talk about the role, the responsibility of the men, and what they do and how they could, bring these conversations to the forefront, which is interesting because a lot of them are afraid to bring the conversation to the forefront, because then they would have to confront their own patriarchy and privilege and misogynoir. And so that's another conversation we have to have within the Black church, which needs to be on the table. So you're absolutely right. Thank you all. This is a really great conversation. I'm glad you all are raising these questions.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a further complexity to the work that, like, I think that the work that you're doing is already, I think, a certain level of complexity. But then with, and you said that some of your interest was in this as well, and some of your studies were with gender and sexuality. And so with some of those traditional things shifting, but also just how we understand those things shifting, that this also shifts the conversation around what we're talking about. So I'm glad to see these things too. It's really cool.
Yeah, thank you. Sarah says yes, because of this asymmetric power dynamic
Right.
between pastor and parishioner. Is always the pastor's responsibility to set the boundary. Exactly, it's always the pastor's responsibility to set the boundary. That's one of the things we have to talk about: power and privilege within the Black church, in churches, period, and how that plays a huge part in what's happening. Why it continues to persist. So I can read something, if you all don't mind. I will share just a few pages of how I'm defining first aid, so you all can get a better sense of what I'm writing. And I would love feedback. Let me know what you hear, please. It's a working document. So
the beta readers now, yeah. No, that would be fantastic. We'd love to hear.
That'd be great. And let me know what you all think. Okay. So I'll start in the middle here, and I'll say, okay, so if women are carriers of seeds of us, human life and form, then it is not impossible to imagine that they are carriers of the word. They are carriers of life in human and spiritual formation. They are the wombs of life. Women are in vibrational sync with the universe. Their heartbeat, rhythm, pace, and breath is our heartbeat, rhythm, and pace. Women have been entrusted to hold that which is sacred of the mysteries of the life and to care for us in the other world of which we reside. They are the portals from which we emerge, finding ourselves in order to relocate ourselves in our purpose and deeds. They stand in as the life force in giving the life lending itself to their natural and nature. We come from women, the word carriers, the word holders, the word bringers. They are, and it is written, the word became flesh. Those African women who were snatched from their homeland and forced across the Atlantic to worlds unknown remained faithful to their religious and spiritual practices. They walked and talked with the ancestors. They marched, danced, and sang to their creator and higher supreme being. They held on to the roots, anchors, and traditions of their spiritual foundations. They understood their task, their purpose as word carriers and holders. They were the spirit catchers and deliverers. The enslavers would attempt to beat it out of them, beat the words from their throats, forcing them to speak new language and new words. But those African women buried the entrusted word into their bodies and spirits and souls. The enslaver cut out their tongues that they cannot speak it, but the women performed the word through dance and practice. The way they moved and swayed through the plantations like strong willow and magnolia trees. The winds pushed through their bodies and under their feet. The word found new ways of expression through the body and acts in the body. And when the enslavers could not force them to speak new words, they tried to beat it out of their bodies. They tormented and tortured African women's bodies, maiming them, scorching them, branding them. And when that didn't work, the enslavers tried to rape it out of African women's wombs. There, in the sacredness of life and production, the African women's sanctity was violated by white enslavers attempting to mute and converge their DNA. Yet that did not work. For what is written above in the other place, that sacred space cannot be changed by man below. As these women were shackled and led into the belly of slave ships that hummed and chanted in tones which shook the universal plane. The world reconfigured itself into that pattern, shifting these African women, first ladies in their homeland, first ladies in their tribe, became first ladies on the slave ships. They were the bearers of the word and carriers of the internal life force of being. These African women helped to catch our souls and carry them across the Atlantic Ocean. Just like they caught babies when they were being born in their villages, they caught the souls of those enslaved Africans on the slave ships. Those slaves were babies, somebody's babies. They needed catching, holding on to, deliverance. They caught the souls of those who perished along the way. They caught and released them back into the portal, the sacredness, sending them back home. They caught the souls of those who whined, screamed, and yelled for mercy, for grace. These first ladies on slave ships laid in the hellish tomb in the hellish bowels of death and spoke life, affirmed life. They reached into the mouth of the monster, shoved their hands into the gorged pit of stench and death, and snatched those souls out. And they gave life to all in that damnation of hell and carried them to the new lands. With one foot firmly planted in Africa, the foundations of the world and of life, African women positioned their bodies, adjusted their hips, swayed their buttocks, and placed the other foot firmly throughout the diaspora and here in the new world. Their voices carried across the Atlantic Ocean winds, thrusting forth the mighty clouds. Their hums and cries echoed like thunder as their words clapped in the sky and rumbled through the air. They spoke. The thunderous timbre of their grace sang in harmonies unheard by the human ear. In a new land with a new language and religion, these women would transform their role and position, versing through worlds of African prophetics, prophets, divine gods and goddesses. Here in America, where in the new world they had one God, one religion. African peoples were stripped of their spiritual armor, just as the enslavers tried to strip off the black flesh, gnashing, whipping, tarring, and burning black bodies. Yet nothing could destroy African people's spiritual connectedness. Nothing, no thing, no one. These women, strong and firm, will become first ladies on the plantation, many adopting the new language and new religion, fusing it with their African Europa and spiritual practices. They translated the foreign tongue and language into their own, remixing and rehashing the Christian terminologies, scriptures, and stories they heard their enslavers preaching to their own kind. African people were another kind, another species, they would say. They were not privy to their lives, white lives, but religion was something that could make the Africans human, maybe, not the other. Religion was pushed into their throats, stuffing Jesus and slavery and white dominance and obedience into their mouths and ears. These women were on the plantations, in the fields, the big houses, and traveling with their enslavers. They were positioned, stationed in rightful places and spaces, not too obvious, invisibly visible, dark faces and white spaces passing through with trays and foods, or cleaning and washing, or nursing white babies, or listening to white folks reading, talking, and preaching about their religion and religious faith. They heard about God, Jesus, and the other characters in the Bible, the book they were forbidden to read. The words they could not have access to, but were first to learn about. The Bible and its words would spill over, dropping into the plates of women's ears like ripe fruit falling from a tree, ready to be plucked and eaten, devoured. The word found fertile storage in the women, like seeds in a dark ground of rich soil, watered and nurtured until its time. The seeds of the word was in the wombs and crevices of Black women, waiting for its time to sprout and bring forth its rich fruit. It would grow, stirring of desire and purpose and mission. It would plant in the women and blossom in their movements and speech. These women on the plantation would formulate in the hush arbors, speaking and witnessing and testifying of the word, the new and strange language they heard. They would speak it back in African proverbs, helping us to remember parts of ourselves and the new world we had encountered. These women would be in the fields plucking the cotton and also plucking us from the thorny bush of slavery. They would sing and hum inaudible African phrases and words for those who could hear, heard. Enslaved Africans understood this hum, the words, the breathing and panting of life, saving us, pushing us, urging us not to give up, but find that within us, each of us, the power to move and fight and seek liberation, freedom. They would soak it up in their bones, allowing it to become the new marrow, sustaining life and rebuilding new life. They caught us, caught the souls and spirits, those seeking freedom, running north, following the North Star, because that is where new hope lived, new life. First ladies of the plantation were married to the preachers on the plantation. They understood the work and purpose their husbands held, telling enslaved persons to obey their masters, yet helping them navigate the biblical stories, scriptures, and characters who resembled, almost paralleled their lives. In secret messages preached through the scriptures, they told enslaved persons how to get free, believe in miracles, have faith, and rely on something much bigger, a divine holiness. The enslaved believed the story of Moses and the Israelites. It was their story. Moses went to Pharaoh and God, as God commanded, and demanded that the Israelites, the enslaved, be freed. Let my people go. Moses returned time and time again with God's message to let the enslaved people go, release them. Pharaoh refused, and in his hardened heart, God would release a series of plagues until Pharaoh released the Israelites. They were delivered to the promised land, freedom. God's word stood. And those on the plantation who heard the story believed. They raised their hands to the heavens, stretching them as high as they could, believing God would deliver them from the hell of slavery, from Pharaoh, their white captors. The enslaved held on to the story of Moses, carried with them into the big fields, the big house, farm, and everywhere they went. The story of God delivering the enslaved vibrated in their spirits and souls. It stirred within them as they picked the cotton, chopped the sugar cane, plowed the land, stirred the beans, fried the chicken, baked the bread, cleaned master's room, felt the whip, screamed from the hot iron branding their flesh, the chopping of limbs, and all the beatings on their bodies. The story of Moses thumped in their hearts. The enslaved would be delivered into the promised land. It was real because it was written in that book, the Bible that the white man would read from and preach. The book the enslaved knew they were forbidden to read, to touch. The precious words in the book gave them hope. I'll stop there. Just to give you more sense.
That was incredible. Thank you for sharing too. I know how difficult it is to share someone's work a lot of the time. So I really like how you're taking this, you're linking this history, right? One of my questions that I had, and we're just coming up on 15 minutes, so if people have questions or comments about that reading, please in the Q&A, feel free and we'll get to you. One of my questions was the history of this topic. How do you see it shift over time? So, I mean, we've already talked a little bit, very briefly, just about things like, okay, now we're starting to look at the patriarchy notions in this, or we're starting to look at the complex gender roles or some of the sexual relations, you know, some of these you know, or what happens when the Black First Lady is also the pastor, you know. So I'm wondering, you're linking it to this history way back, like into slavery, right, and before. And so how do you see, I guess, if I were to ask you, would you see Black First Ladies of the Black Church like there is no beginning, or its beginning is the beginning? I don't know if that would be fair, if that's kind of the work that you're doing. You know?
No, that's a really great question, Colin. And it's not a significant moment that we can point to and say, this is when it happened, this is when it occurred. But I'm giving it this language of, you know, it happened, they were already in their own homeland, serving as, you know, I said, they're the carriers of the word.
Yeah.
So they've already been part of the nurturing of life, of being the word. So what does that mean to continue to that legacy, to carry that with you, you know, through slavery, through the diaspora, into a new land, this calling that has always been a part of their identity of who they are. So that's where I want to, you know, just do this traveling, like you said, this nuancing. It's not just a modern concept. These women were doing this work, you know, pre-slavery, in their own African continent, and in their home villages and cities where they were located. When they got here to the United States, what does that look like? How does that transform? That's why I'm trying to take you through the portal of, you know, being on a slave ship, and how they continue to be that spiritual guide and nurture us to catch our spirits, those who didn't want to transform and come into the new world. So I thought about, I don't know if you heard the term catching babies. I don't know if you heard the term.
I'm not. Okay. Do you want to explain it? Yeah, I feel like I might have heard it, but I'm not going to pretend that I know it.
For a lot of people, probably heard of it. You know, catching babies in the context that women who are I'm drawing a blank on the word. Oh God, catching babies. Serve as not surrogates. What's the word? Oh my God, someone's help me. Someone, you know the word.
Midwife?
Midwife. Yes, thank you, Natalie. The midwife. So so in African tradition, it's catching babies. So they would go and they would help other women deliver their babies. So what does that mean in the spiritual sense? To catch a baby, to help bring them and usher them into the new world. The same, I'm using that as a theme of how we catch souls in the theological sense, to help deliver and bring them into Christ or into the Christianity. Because when we're all new and young in Christ, we all have to be nurtured into the faith tradition. So what does that mean for these first ladies to catch souls, souls that are in transition, souls that are lost, souls that are struggling to find their way? And I'm saying how these first ladies become that portal, that guide. Women have always done. I think women continue to do that work throughout the church, period. Guide so many of us and lead us back. I don't know, and if some of y'all can speak to it, participants or even you, Colin, I know I grew up in a home where, before I left out of the house, my aunt or my grandmother, if I was traveling somewhere, they would always pray. We don't pray for you when you're on that road. But they're always, praying for us. My grandmother was always praying for me. My mother was always praying for me. My aunts were always praying for me. And I, when you're younger, it doesn't mean anything. Like, okay, this is what they do.
Thanks, Mom.
Right, exactly. Thanks, Mom. When you get older, you start to understand, there's a community that's happening that I think what I'm trying to help nuances understand is there's a relationship that they have developed or nurtured. And I remember my grandmother would work in the yard a lot, and she would always be talking to the plants. And I was like, thought it was weird. She said, you have to go to the source. And she would talk to the trees, and she would talk, and she was like, and so as I'm writing this book, I'm starting to understand what that meant, of being one with nature, being one with the universe, and helping to nuance. And what does that mean to become a portal to help guide and direct those of us who are struggling? And these women have been such a huge source in my life, not only in my personal life, but these first ladies who I have met, who have helped nurture me back into a space. And we talk about gender and sexuality and things of that nature, because there are some conversations I couldn't have with the pastor or the preacher that I felt more comfortable going to the first lady. And that's sometimes what they do. They help to serve as that nurturing guide, in a way. They have words, and they become life force in a way. And so that's what I'm trying to help others to see, is not just a title bequeathed and you act accordingly. It's the calling that they embody and imbue, that they know that they have been given. That's why I say each woman will come to her own conclusion of, what she wants to provide as a service to community and to the church as a whole. So, so it's very nuanced. It's not as cut and dry as we want to say. I think slavery helped play a huge part of that, because I said, these women are on the plantation, helping to usher us through and give us something to hope for, a salvation, if that makes sense. If we use theological context, what does liberation look like in far as salvation? Is heaven for me? Is that my fate? Is my fate hell?
And you said the book that they're not allowed to read or touch, right?
Right.
Yeah. Which also adds this element of sacred right? That which is out of reach, but then which becomes in reach. And actually on that, I really wanted to ask you, you even mentioned like the pre-Christian aspect of this as well, right? So that, here we have, you're talking about faith not in a institutional religion section at some part in your discussion there in your papers, and I'm curious about what is there something lost, or what complexity do we have when you say Jesus is being forced down a throat, right? But then that becomes a strong faith, right? So it's like this faith is almost separate from, like, I don't want to put words in your mouth here. I'm just kind of curious what you have to say about that extra complexity of this religion shifting, right?
Yeah, yeah. So we know that they introduced the Christianity in America,
Right.
um, and so even though they already have a faith that they believe, some would say it was Yoruba or Islam. It depends what part of Africa we're situated, but um, enslaved persons when they come to America are stripped of everything. So the only thing that they knew that they had that was not being able, they could not force or take away from them, which is what was on the inside, right? You can't take someone's faith from them.
Right. Right.
I can take your language. I can force you to speak another language. I can force you to, shave your hair, dress a certain way and do all other things, and with most people when they come to America, they do conform in some regard. But one thing you can't strip away from them is their faith. And that's what I was talking about. So they've done this infusing of the faith because they understood there were some components of Christianity that made sense to them because they served gods. They had, especially in Catholicism, because they had priests, they had angels, and oh my God, I'm trying to think on the other thing.
Saints. We got saints.
Yes,
We got lots of stuff.
Yeah, yeah. So for in African religions, they were able to make sense of that because they said we recognize and serve various deities. So that's why it was easy for them to translate or to accommodate Catholicism, particularly, and Christianity.
Yeah.
And if those of you who are not familiar, but during slavery, a lot of the Civil War and all of that. If you're not familiar with Florida, once before it was Florida, it was owned by the Spaniards. And America was fighting the Spanish War, and they wanted Florida. So Spain offered a lot of Black enslaved persons freedom if they joined their party to fight with them. So a lot of enslaved persons joined Spain to fight against America. And even though they lost the war, but they promised that they would take them back to Spain with them. So a lot of them ended up going back to Spain once the war was over. But again, because the translation of Catholicism was very easy for them to accept with the various practices. And the same happened with California and Mexico, if you're not familiar with that story.
Yeah. My sort of second part of that question, because I really like how you're talking about the word and the seed, and like in the beginning was the word, right? What we think of that, and here you're talking about in the beginning was the word before Christianity, right? In many ways, right? So anyway, I just really like that. But my second follow-up question of this, and I'm curious about the secular impact, right? So now that you have secularization, you've been talking about Black First Ladies in the Black Church as, it almost sounds like they take care of so much of this secular aspect as well, this aspect that is not necessarily spiritual, but is intertwined with spirituality, right? So I'm wondering, what is the complexity or the impact of the rise of secularity or the decline of church populations or aging populations in churches and things on that role and on the significance of that role? And or is secularity appropriating some of this? I don't know. I'm just kind of wondering. some of that.
Ooh, that's very good. I love that.
You can put it in the book.
Right, exactly. That gives me another theme to think about. Secularity plays a huge part. You're right, because the church doesn't have the same impact that it had then as it does today as it did then.
Right.
Particularly when in the Black Lives Matter movement, there seems to be a division between the church and the state getting involved. One of those problematics of why the Black church does not get involved with the Black Lives Matter movement is because, if y'all are familiar with the Black Lives Matter movement, it was founded by 3 women. 2 are queer identified women. And so when they included Black Lives Matter, but also trans lives, queer lives, the church backed away in some regard, because if you are familiar with the church's stance, particularly in their tenets, that queer identity and sexuality, they take firm stances. So I think for young people to get involved, they start now to see, as someone raised the question earlier, Natalie, about patriarchy and misogynoir. Right. Sexism and homophobia continues to be a pervasive part of that as well. So you talk about the secularity as well, so that becomes a huge part. So a lot of Black first ladies are being challenged in that regard, because where do they stand, and a lot of them do stand, on the church's side, but a lot defer, like, hey, we have to be more inclusive. It's secularity is becoming a huge issue. Complexes, and I love how you threw that in there, Colin. Thank you for mixing it up.
Yeah, no worries. That's awesome. You've got a couple other comments here that I'll see if we can get to really quickly, because we're just coming up to 9 o'clock. It's been an awesome discussion. Someone's asking, actually, if that piece that you read, is that the introduction, or is that a different part of the?
Yes, it is the introduction. Thank you. Who said that? Oh, yeah. Keith. Yes, Keith. Things are very poetic.
It's very poetic. Yeah. Someone else is asking if you have an estimated date when the book is available, because they're looking forward to it. And this is like the nightmare question of, like, I've published some things too, and it's like, oh, don't ask me when it is. I don't know. I don't know. Do you have a date at all?
Yeah, no, we don't have a date yet. So as soon as I get the date, Colin, I would definitely let you know when the date approaches.
Yeah, we would be happy to help you with some promotion. Awesome. Thank you, Sarah, for thank you. I appreciate that. And someone else here said, been reading The Seventh Shrine from the Middle Passage of the Mountaintop by Orland Bishop. Bishop is an ordinary philosopher like our own Eliot. He's done some academic work rooted in African mysticism and European Hermeticism. Also street level work mediating with rival gangs in Watts.
Wow.
Frames the Middle Passage in terms of initiation, as calling in terms of service, the word, covenants, ritual, and ancestral memory. Found it profoundly spiritual and practical book.
Oh,
very
wow.
Interesting.
Thank you for that, Thomas.
Yeah.
I'm going to order this book. Thank you.
Boom, done.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, that was a generous gift. You all are generous. I love this. You are great. You have some great questions.
Hey, no problem. Pull them out of nowhere.
And I didn't want to speak in theoretical and academic ease language, so.
No, I really appreciate the openness. I really appreciate you sharing your work as well, because I know sometimes it's tempting to keep that behind the veil. So thank you for pulling that out for us. And yeah, as Praxis, it's my job and our job collectively to push academics a little bit and poke them and kind of, get out of the textbook. So I really appreciate you doing that and talking very practically about this, the communities that are forming or struggling or whatnot. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome.
Thank
Thank you all so much for joining Praxis Speaker Series. Really appreciate it. We hope you had a great time. And we should have another Bible study this month. I'll send that out to if you're part of Praxis. And we should have another speaker series next month. Stay tuned. Thank you so much, Dr. Terrance Dean, for coming on and talking about such an important topic with us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you all. Thank you so much. I really appreciate this. And thank you, Mark and Pat. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Eli. I see you.
Thanks, guys. Have a good rest of the night.